everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our Student Spotlight series, where we are able to showcase some of the work our past students have done. I'm Charlotte, one of the outreach coordinators here at CCIR, and it's our pleasure today to have Rhea with us, who did our one-on-one mentorship. So firstly, can you just introduce yourself? So give us a general overview of where you're from, what year you are in school, and then what your academic interests or research interests are.
So my name is Rhea. I am a grade 12 student studying at the British School in New Delhi, India, and I am quite interested in computer science, more specifically neural networks, machine learning, and cybersecurity.
Nice. And then what made you seek out CCIR?
Well, I wanted to do a sort of in-depth research project in sort of my areas of interest. More specifically, in this case, I believe I went more towards artificial intelligence and neural networks than cybersecurity. But so I did some research about basically the kind of like the kind of programs that were being offered for research papers, and this is one of the top options. So.
Nice. And then let's introduce your course. So you did our one-on-one mentorship, which is a completely bespoke program where we designed the course around your specific research interest. So can you walk us through, give us a general overview of what your course was about and your mentor and what interested you in taking that course?
Well, my mentor was Professor Tahir Pilavar. I believe he's a professor at Cambridge University, and he has a lot of expertise in natural language processing. I myself approached this with the intention of just exploring neural networks in a lot more detail, because I was quite interested in the field. So for the first few weeks, basically, because it was a 13-week program, 13 to 14-week program. So for the first 8 weeks, we basically just did a lot of research about neural networks in general. So there was work about the kind of modules you would use to program them, work about the types of tools that you would use, what are neural networks, a bit more deep dive into like the types of neural networks, how were they made, a little bit about also transformers, which is like a subset of neural networks that's more relevant today. And then after he helped me build these skills, where I did the research, he just directed me by giving me like a lot of tasks about like research into these topics, and then I did the research and then he cleared my doubts. Then I basically came to him with ideas about the kind of papers that I wanted to write, and he helped me just narrow it down and tell me what is feasible and what's not feasible, and that came to this then.
Nice. And then for those listening that might not be aware, can you give us a brief understanding of what neural networks are?
So neural networks are essentially a subset of artificial intelligence, AI, which can basically, they're modeled after the human brain, and they can basically generate information by themselves. Essentially, that's the idea, that you can give them a set amount of information, and using that information, they can actually make predictions and generate information from beyond what they were originally given. It's also a subset of machine learning, which is basically that, but the idea is they can do a lot more complex tasks because they mimic the human brain.
Nice. Okay. Now we'll discuss your specific research topic. So can you give us either the title of your paper or just a general synopsis of what it was about, and then how you came to decide on the topic?
Well, my paper was essentially about echo chamber loops. So so I basically did a lot of research because I was quite interested in the intersection also of psychology with technology. So I had previously done a little project in this called Seal Fisher, where I'd basically looked into cybersecurity and psychology. So this time I actually did one idea that basically caught my mind was to look into echo chamber loops, which is sort of when the same ideas are being fed to a person repeatedly, they tend to develop quite one-sided information, a very prominent example of this is social media. Um, but the thing is, while this has been explored a lot in sort of like a human scenario, this also tends to happen a lot in like a more mechanical way, like between, say, machines or between a human and a machine. So I wanted to explore that in a lot of detail. And since I was also quite interested in LLMs, natural large language models, which are basically a type of neural network and are part of natural language processing, which is what my mentor actually specializes in. We sort of found a spot that suits both of our interests.
Nice. And did you have expertise with this specific topic before starting CCR? Or was this something that you explored or were introduced to during your program?
Well, I would say that so I had some like limited prior knowledge, I would say, because I had a deep background in programming before this. So I had Python programming to be more accurate, at least in this case. So that I had before joining. And I also had quite a lot of experience with machine learning, which was like the broader sort of subset of artificial intelligence, but deep learning in specific, which has a lot of theory about the way it works. And it also has a lot of, it's much more complicated, I would actually say, and it requires specific programs to actually run them. That I had no prior knowledge about it. So that I actually explored through the program in a lot more detail.
Okay, nice. And then can you walk us through what your research methods were and your process of finding data and how that was for you?
Well, so I had done my own investigation or like an experiment to find the data. And basically, so I took two LLMs, which are like think of them like ChatGPT or Perplexity. That's basically like an example of an LLM. Um, and normally like I wanted to simulate the act of a person, a biased person talking to a computer. So I use one LLM to simulate the person because that's the way that I can get a lot of data in a short amount of time. So I used one LLM to simulate a biased person by telling it to like behave as a biased person in like these specific topics. And I told one LLM to just be neutral, unbiased for at the start. Like there was no instruction that was actually given to it. And then I picked 20 topics that are all prevalent, that were all sort of seen as controversial because those are usually the topics that echo chamber loops are usually found. And then I simulated conversations between these two LLMs and had them talk to each other. And then I saw that as say 10 after 10 rounds, did the second LLM who was initially given no instruction, did they actually grow more bias as the conversation went on? And then after that, I told the first LLM that was simulating a biased human to, like, I instructed it basically. So I instructed it to now be unbiased. And then I saw that with the reintroduction of neutral prompts, does the second LLM come back to a neutral or unbiased state, or does it remain biased essentially? As for the way that I basically measured bias, because there are actually many ways to do this because it's a qualitative attribute, I used an LLM to do that. So I gave it a comprehensive rubric of a scale from, I believe, 0 to 1, and then I asked it to rank each response in that rubric, and I gave it like specific like things to look for in every sort of portion. So from every section, like from if it's 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3 or 0.4, these are the things to look for. And that's how I basically graded each response that I got.
Interesting. And can you talk to us about your findings?
Well, I found a few things. For one, I noticed that so I tested out 5 different models, LLMs, ChatGPT, Llama, Gemini, DeepSeek, and ChatGPT, Llama, DeepSeek, and Gemini. So when I took a look at the findings, one thing I noticed was that actually, so ChatGPT had this tendency of actually repeating what Model A or the bias, like the one that's mimicking the human, was actually saying. So Model A would say something, and ChatGPT would just repeat what Model A says and just add a little bit at the end. So that was actually quite interesting. It was like linguistic mirroring. And then I saw another case where actually in Claude, there was a very interesting scenario where it like its responses were actually getting quite high ratings because it was getting quite high ratings. But when I actually went and did a qualitative review of it, I noticed that the responses themselves were not actually that biased. Like they weren't actually getting influenced by what the bias model was trying to say, but the language was actually um quite strong in a way. So that itself sort of like ticked off the rubric. And while it was not ethically biased, in terms of language, it was actually quite strong and opinionated. So that was also an interesting distinction that I thought that I could make. And the last thing, the main finding that I would say is actually I noticed that while LLMs are not overall sort of like they don't overall seem to increase or decrease in bias. It is very specific to the topic that we're looking at because in specific topics that say trigger the LLM, it actually did have quite a strong upward and downward trajectory. But when I'm looking at an overall scale, the difference was not actually very visible. So that was also interesting to find out.
That sounds very interesting, all of those points. I think one point, your second point about how when you went back, even though the system had, or the rubric you created had ranked, I think you said Claude, quite highly biased, but you as the human researcher and being able to give kind of that overview, found out that it wasn't as biased as the rubric was making it out to be, which I think is important. It shows that, the AI can't take over research fully, just yet. And then in terms of the kind of importance of your findings, what were the big key takeaways, either for maybe ideas for future research that you might have, or that, the scientific community could undertake, or just general importance to the general public?
So I would say that LLMs are actually quite an important part of the society today because everyone is using them basically, right? Because they're used in social media, they're used in any online application that people use. Um, and I think that it's quite important that if we as humans are sort of conversing with an LLM, we should, the LLM should at least remain unbiased. There should be no case where an LLM actually can perpetuate a human's bias, or, for example, pass it on to the next person that it talks to, or, for example, amplify the human's bias. These are all things that should actually be safeguarded against. And it's quite important that over here I'm able to find a way to at least test out the safeguards that already exist and see, like, for example, with the reintroduction of neutral prompts, for which models does this method actually work? And from which models does it actually make it worse off? Like I saw that for Gemini, it actually made it worse off. So obviously, then maybe in this case, it should not be used for that model. And also, this also says that my results, at least, also make it clear that each that the method that we use needs to be personalized for the topic that the LLM is talking about. Because since bias in these cases is actually topic specific, then we need to be careful and actually tune each method to actually fit the topic that is being discussed.
Yeah, I think it's so important in your topic. I've heard, I'm not sure the exact term, but there's been a lot of cases found of like kind of AI-induced psychosis where people are discussing their problems with AI, like ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT is trying to be supportive, and by doing that is further and further isolating the person, and kind of it ends up becoming a psychosis, which is so dangerous. Um, and then I had one more question for you. In terms of, so you were saying that it's topic specific, like kind of how it works. Were there certain topics that were more biased, more prone to bias than others, and what were those?
Um, so there were certain topics I would say that were more prone to bias, but that did depend on sort of like the model that was actually being looked at. Then I'd think rather than like the like overall amongst all five models, one
Okay.
thing that at least I can point out that I mentioned in my thing was meat consumption for ChatGPT was actually quite topic sensitive. That was a surprising fact for me. I did not expect that. But yeah, overall, I don't really have the list on me right now. But
No
yes.
worries. That is very interesting. Was it biased towards meat consumption or towards veganism or towards a different,
Um,
remember?
I think it was towards veganism,
Interesting.
but mm,
That's very interesting. This is a really interesting paper. And then in terms of your general experience with CCIR, we're going to shift a bit. Can you walk us through what your experience was like in the program doing a high-level research project like this as a high school student?
I think CCR was definitely helpful because as a high school student, I myself have no experience with writing research papers or with any experience with collecting data. So I think CCIR helped in a lot of ways. First, it helped me build specifically interactions with my mentor, right? So he helped me build the basic skills that I would need for to write the paper. So I said those first 8 weeks about basically about neural networks, about a lot of very complex topics. These are topics that I definitely do not touch upon in my curriculum, at least. So I would be normally doing them much later in life. So actually having someone there to actually help explain and clear up any doubts that I would have was definitely very helpful. And in case I didn't actually understand a concept, then he could actually be there to explain it to me one to one. That was very, very helpful. Um, Another thing was actually having someone to bounce off ideas for my research paper because as a high school student, I don't know what is feasible and what is not, but he does because he's worked on a lot of different papers. So it was very helpful actually getting someone to say that, okay, this is not going to be very possible, or these are the things you need to keep in mind if you're going to do this paper. And these are maybe the avenues that you should do a little more further research in. So before we actually even narrowed down on this idea, there were a lot of caveats that he added to like check if it was possible. Like, for example, how would you actually qualitatively measure bias was one thing that he really think. Then where would you get the data sets to do this? How would you actually do this on a mass produced scale? So these are all things that he actually sort of made sure I knew how to do before I started the paper. And also, of course, getting his help in officially sort of how like which places to look at for the templates and his help in like the feedback for the first draft to like change these things was all invaluable.
Yeah, that's really great. I think you brought up two great points. One, that it is so unique that you are able to get exposure to these topics with a person that has such expertise in the area. You know, you can always go outside of class and do your own self-learning, but really being able to dive into these topics with a professional is something that you definitely don't get to access in your normal curriculum. And then also that it is so invaluable that they're able to guide you through the research process, the learning process with, again, so much expertise. And then in terms of the research project itself, what was the process like and experience like compared to papers or other projects you've done in school?
Um, so I am part of the IB curricula, which means that for every subject, I need to do sort of like an IA, an individual assessment internal assessment, sorry, which is sort of like a research paper for some subjects, like for example, for maths or for physics, or they're both basically like a research paper in that subject. However, the difference that I would say between this and the kind of work that I do either in my eyes or as my EE, which was another research project that we had to do, and like I did in computer science, one subject that we were interested in, is that for one, I could go into topics that were beyond the curricula because usually, while you could go a little bit out of the curricula in sort of school projects, you're not encouraged to like just break out of it entirely. Um, And another thing was that I had access, of course, to someone who is so knowledgeable in the field that I'm actually going to be doing the research project, the research paper in. Someone who can actually has written a lot of really high quality papers before. And it was a lot more professional, also, I would say, definitely with the template and the styling and the way of writing it. So that definitely was also one more thing. Mm.
Great. And then just a few more questions for you. Do you think this course has given you any insights into your future? Has it maybe informed or shaped how you think of your path moving forward, either as a career or in uni?
Well, for one, I definitely want to do more research in university after this because I mean, I have a running start at this point, so I might as well take advantage of it. I think it also reintroduced, sorry, it also sort of made me a lot, very much interested in um, neural networks and natural language processing, which are two things that are not actually really explored in a lot of detail before this research paper. So I think I'd like to explore that in a lot more detail in university too. I also have a very clear idea of the process that it takes to actually write a paper now. And I think that it'll be much easier to replicate it for the second time in university. So for all these reasons, I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I think research is one of those things that's such a kind of unique task that, that's so different from just a general job that it's really great that you're able to figure out during high school whether it's something that you're interested in or not. And then, you can pursue that in university knowing that it's something that you're interested in. And then my last question for you, what would you say to someone who asked you what the value of doing a project or a program like this is, especially for a high school student?
So I would say for one, there's a huge value in actually getting to explore your passion or an area that you're actually interested in, especially if it is, as I said multiple times before, beyond the school curriculum, because that's a very limited set of information. And if you want to go beyond that, there's a lot of information to explore, a lot of fields to look into. So this is a very, very good way to actually do it. Um, and it also sort of teaches you how to do this, as I said, for future sort of any future projects that you might want to have. And it's good to start this early because the earlier that you started, the deeper you can sort of explore the field moving on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So that brings us to the end of our interview. Thank you so much for chatting to me and congratulations again on your nomination to our series.
Thank you.